Yu-Gi-Oh, more so than any other card game, is defined by speed. Games end in just a few turns, and effects that generate immediate value are given extremely high priority by the player base. So, cards that take multiple turns to have an effect are obviously at odds with this design philosophy. Despite this, some of these cards have actually found a place in the game. Today, we're going to take a look at cards that take multiple turns to work, and see what makes a successful card in this category and what makes a total flop. There are a few categories we can put multi-cards into. First, we have cards that remove monsters after a certain amount of time has passed, namely Zone Eater, Swordsman from a Distant Land, and Extinction on schedule. The second are cards that move cards around after a certain number of turns have passed, such as Gold Sarcophagus and Future Fusion. The final category are cards that win you a game if enough time has passed, such as the infamous Final Countdown and Destiny board. All of these cards share similar flaws, but have found success at times due to their differences. Before we can talk about how some of these cards have broken the mold and found a use in competitive formats, we first have to talk about why most of these cards completely failed. The easiest bunch of these cards to start with are the monster removal effects. Zone Eater is a level 1 monster with 250 attack and 200 defense, with the effect where a monster attacked by this card is destroyed during the end phase of the 5th turn after that attack. Swordsman from a Distant Land is almost identical, also being a level 1 monster that destroys a monster after 5 turns have passed. Extinction on schedule is more interesting, being a normal trap that lets you pay 2,000 life points during the main phase, and then during the end of the 3rd battle phase after this card's activation, each player sends all cards they control to the graveyard. Now, it has to be said that Zone Eater and Swordsman are just excruciatingly bad in a way that makes it difficult to think that Konami ever intended them to see play. While they were very early cards, they were competing with cards like Maneater Bug from the first set for normal summons that could function as removal. And Maneater doesn't require you take battle damage to get its destruction effect. They would further be power crept by cards like Exiled Force and DD Warrior Lady, normal summons that could out just about any monster your opponent summoned. Warrior Lady also functioned through battle, and banished the other monster instead of destroying it. Playing Zone Eater or Swordsman meant that you were taking battle damage you didn't need to, and giving up the upsides of banishing the opponent's monster, or being able to skip going to the battle that other cards in the category gave you. Meaning that even before we think about the fact that it takes 5 turns to destroy the monster they battled, they're already really bad cards. When you consider those implications, the card becomes basically useless. In Yu-Gi-Oh, monsters on field are powerful resources and always have been. Destroying an opponent's monster doesn't just mean that you deal with that monster, it also means it can't be used to tribute summon out a powerful monster on the next turn, setting your opponent back substantially in terms of tempo. Waiting 5 turns to destroy the monster means that they have 2 full turns to use that monster's materials for something before Zone Eater or Swordsman finally resolves. This problem has only gotten worse over time, as more and more summoning mechanics have been printed that allow players to turn these monsters into another monster, making this delayed destruction more and more useless as time goes on. This does highlight one big problem with multi-turn effects, which is that they give your opponent time to react to what you're going to do. The more time your opponent has to figure out what your deck is doing, the more time they have to draw it out, or develop a plan to stop whatever you're up to. It's usually the case in card games that the fewer turns it takes for your deck to accomplish its game plan, the better. And this is taken to the nth degree at Yu-Gi-Oh with how fast the pace of play is. The third card in this category does a good job fixing these issues, at least to a degree. Extinction on schedule has multiple upsides over the 2 monsters, for one requiring much less time to actually resolve its effect. If you activated the turn after you set it, before your opponent's battle phase, then they'll only have 1 more turn to prepare for the inevitable board wipe they're going to be put through. On top of giving your opponent less time to respond, Extinction also has an effect that actually synergizes somewhat well with being put on a timer. Unlike the Zone Eaters, which only target 1 monster, and therefore can be played around by getting rid of that monster on your own terms, Extinction targets all cards in play instead of a specific threat. This means your opponent can't keep anything useful on board when Extinction finally goes off, which makes it a lot more useful than the previous cards. However, it's still just too slow to be of any use. It still gives your opponent 2 battle phases before it removes anything, which is more than enough time to perform an OTK. And it was back when this card was released around the time of Clash of Rebellions when decks like Cosmo were slamming Dark Destroyers into play on turn 1, This means in order to get the full effect of Extinction, you have to dedicate other cards in your strategy to keeping yourself alive. This simply isn't worth it, especially since there are so many other cards that can do most of Extinction's job but much faster. Cards like Dark Hole and Torrential Tribute are more effective answers to your opponent's board. There are some upsides to Extinction, like getting rid of spell and trap cards and not being a destroy effect, but waiting 3 turns is too high of a cost for these upsides. This goes into the next category of cards very nicely. When looking at the previous cards, the most obvious question to ask is what effect would make waiting several turns for it to go off be worth it? Well, the answer is just winning the game on the spot. Final Countdown and Destiny Board both force the player to wait several turns, and once their effect has fully finished resolving, they win you the game. Final Countdown simply makes you pay 2,000 life points, and then after 20 turns have passed, you win the game. Destiny Board, on the other hand, is a lot more complicated. This is a continuous trap with the effect where, once per turn during your opponent's end phase, you can activate in sequence one of the Spirit Message cards from your hand or deck. Once all 4 Spirit Message cards are activated, you win the duel. Also, if any Spirit Message or Destiny Board card you control leaves the field, you send all of the others to the graveyard as well. There is another card that's sort of in this category, that being Wave Motion Cannon, a continuous spell that lets you send it from your field to the graveyard to inflict 1,000 damage to your opponent for every turn it was up. While not exactly the same, it is a card that makes you wait for several turns to get use out of its effect, and if you keep it around for long enough, you can just dome your opponent for the rest of their life total. Final Countdown and Wave Motion Cannon did see some competitive play. Cannon was used back in the day of sideboards to punish players with insufficient spell and trap removal, as if they let their life total get a bit too low and didn't draw it out in a timely manner, they were finished. Final Countdown, conversely, was only really found in dedicated stall decks. Since Countdown is a normal spell rather than a continuous spell, if it resolves, there's no way for your opponent to stop the count from progressing. At that point, all you have to do is run out the clock. So hiding behind a few cards like Mystic Mine is pretty much an automatic win against unsuspecting players. While they haven't been the best cards ever, the cards have had a small splash in competitive. Destiny Board, on the other hand, has never really been playable for a few reasons. For one, having to play the Spirit Message cards is absolutely awful. These cards literally do nothing when you draw them, so having any of them in your hand is really detrimental. On top of that, Destiny Board can't reset the Spirit Messages from your graveyard, so if you're only playing one of each of the messages and they blow up your Destiny Board the first time around, the combo no longer works. However, worst of all, Destiny Board clogs up all of your spell and trap zones, which makes playing the kind of game Destiny Board wants you to play almost impossible. The way you would want to build a Destiny Board deck is similar to how Final Countdown was played, putting up some floodgates to prevent your opponent from making any progress in the game. However, almost all of these cards are on continuous spell and trap cards, but to resolve Destiny Board's effect, you need all 5 of your spell and trap card zones empty. The only floodgate you can rely on is the now banned Mystic Mine, or those that appear on monsters, and there have been just too many answers to these cards throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history for Destiny Board to ever accomplish anything. It is worth mentioning that this card has received support over the years, with cards like Dark Sanctuary and Dark Spirit Mastery helping to fix the issue we mentioned here, but they couldn't get around just how slow this strategy was. We don't have the time to go into this entire archetype, its specific problems, triumphs, and ultimate failure to convert into competitive, but at the end of the day, it was a slow deck that was too reliant on very specific spell and trap cards staying in play to accomplish anything. We've talked mostly about power level so far, but there's another issue with these cards that we haven't covered yet, and that's how they're designed. As we've established, even powerful forms of interaction like Extinction on schedule simply aren't good enough if you put them on this sort of timer, as the opponent just has too much time to respond to what's about to happen. So the solution was to simply make the cards have a very powerful effect instead, that being literally winning the game on the spot. The problem in design comes from the fact that there's no variation in how you can make these cards. They're either laughably bad, like Zone Eater, or more retrains of the same idea. This is why we only have a few cards with this kind of effect, because there's only so many different versions of Final Countdown you can print before the design gets worn out. Really, what we need is a middle ground between these sorts of effects and a more standard card effect that has an immediate impact on the game. And that's where the last category of multi-turn cards come in. A few cards that are sort of multi-turn cards, but have a more immediate impact on the game. These two cards, Gold Sarcophagus and Future Fusion, are some of the most interesting cards in this category to talk about, as they have a long and storied history at Yu-Gi-Oh! Where they've been used in multiple ways. Gold Sarcophagus is a normal spell with the effect where you banish a card from your deck. Then you add that card to your hand on your second standby phase after this card resolves. Future Fusion is a continuous spell with the effect where, on the first standby phase after this card's activation, you reveal a fusion monster from your extra deck. Then send fusion materials from your deck to the graveyard that can be used to fusion summon that monster. During your next standby phase, you fusion summon that monster. Also, if either that monster or this continuous spell is destroyed, the other is destroyed as well. Gold Sarcophagus is the more straightforward of the two. In the old days, there were cards that were so strong that, in the right circumstances, they could win you the game if used correctly. Power cards like Mirror Force and Gores were so strong that they could change the entire course of the game if not played around. There were also powerful combo starters that you could grab off of Sarcophagus as well, giving it a ton of versatility. However, if we're talking about versatility, we have to talk about the ways in which interacting with the card Sarcophagus banished could be leveraged into a positive. Cards like Return from the Different Dimension and DDR could special summon the banished monster immediately, making it effectively just a reinforcement of the army for any monster in the game. There are also a number of monsters that have positive effects when banished. One of the earliest examples of this is the monster Necroface, which banished the top 5 cards of both players' decks when banished. Banishing this in Grand Manju decks could make that monster huge with only one card, allowing the deck to deal huge damage instantly. More recent applications for the card involved banishing Tri-Brigade Mercurier or one of the Malice monsters to start your combo. While it is cool to see one of these classic slower cards see play in the modern day, most of the actual point of Gold Sarcophagus is currently being ignored. Banishing the card is often the point of activating the card, and the game should probably be over before it even adds the card to your hand. However, there are times when both halves of the effects of Sarcophagus do matter. Banishing Mercurier can come up in games that go too long, as it's a powerful card to have in your hand thanks to its monster negation effect. Still, more recently, it's become even more difficult to design a card that takes so much time to finish resolving its effect before being allowed to play further. Future Fusion has far more complicated history. The version of the card we're looking at now is actually the eroded version, having received a heavy nerf from its initial release. It used to send the fusion materials from the deck to the graveyard immediately upon activation, though it still summoned the fusion monster after 2 of your standby phases have passed. This is a huge nerf, as sending multiple monsters from your deck to the grave is an incredibly powerful effect. One of the most famous exploits was revealing 5-headed dragon, which lets you send any 5 dragon monsters from your deck to the graveyard with Future Fusion. This can basically instantly let you combo off if you send the right cards. This effect was so powerful that often you didn't even care if you got to summon the monsters off of Future Fusion at all. Of course, this isn't always the case. Before the initial banning of Future Fusion, before it received the Zerata, it was used in hero decks to summon monsters such as Elemental Hero Absolute Zero, a monster that was very difficult to play against back in the day. However, after the card's unban and errata in 2017, the card has had a very difficult time seeing play. The game is simply too fast, and there are too many ways for players to deal with Future Fusion before it ever becomes a problem. You can make it a huge combo enabler after a single turn of waiting, but that's just not enough now that most decks have access to spell and trap removal in the extra deck. A single Nightmare Phoenix completely shuts the card down, and that's if they can't find a way to just OTK you and end the game immediately. The card already would have been suspect in the more modern metagame with this errata, but the fact that any spell and trap removal could completely stop it from doing anything means the card is pretty much unusable. However, if Future Fusion wasn't errata, it would still be incredibly powerful and likely still see play to this day thanks to just how strong its Foolish Burial effect is. Once again, we find these multi-turn cards in between a rock and a hard place. Giving them these immediate effects to balance out having to wait for the full effect of the card seems to make it so that players will only play the card for their immediate effects, and the full effect of the cards will become an afterthought. Even if the cards are powerful and capable of seeing competitive play, they've never been able to lean into their intended design successfully. There are a few reasons for this failure, and one of them is simply that the cards are very ill-equipped for the modern game. Again, Gold Sarcophagus was played in decks that just had a bit of banishment synergy because waiting 2 turns to get literally any card you wanted used to be a fair deal. In some sense, it's not the design of these cards that have failed completely, but rather that, like many other mechanics, the power creep of the game has left them to the wayside. Beyond the horrible power creep, there are two other problems that have plagued the mechanic. First is, again, the general lack of design space. But more important than that is that Konami really didn't put much effort into the mechanic. Many of these cards are obviously bad and gimmicky, with the two cards in this mechanic that did see some success seemingly having been accidents. The era when these designs could have worked has passed without Konami really trying particularly hard to make these cards work again, leaving them mostly as a forgotten relic.